to the history of the United Methodist Church in America. Now, let me get the PowerPoint up real quick. So last week's session was on the European history of the Wesley brothers. And this week, we're starting with America itself. But Daniel did mention one part of the Wesley brothers' visit to America. And so it's a telling tale. It could probably become a Lifetime movie, honestly. There's heartbreak, there's love, there's rejection, and there is also scandal. But we'll start with the Wesley brothers on the way for a mission trip to Savannah, Georgia. Right? Who doesn't love good old Savannah? And John becomes a pastor in Savannah, Georgia. Now, on the boat ride over, John, he's in his early 30s, a young guy, and he met a girl named Sophie, who is 18, which in that day and time, that was a reasonable age gap. So they both fall in love on the way over to America. Now, nothing is ever said about what that actually looked like, but it was enough to think that there would be a marriage proposal, especially on Sophie's side. So John goes to his friends, the Moravians. These are the ones that were very extemporaneous. Their hearts were filled with joy, the strangely warm. That's where John Wesley learned all of that. So he goes to the Moravian friends and he's like, what should I do? I made this vow of celibacy earlier in my years, and so do I abandon that and marry Sophie? Or do I stick with that and see where it goes? So they encourage him to actually keep to his vows of lifelong celibacy. So he breaks things off with Sophie, and she is just heartbroken, but still determined to marry, because in that time you didn't want to be single at the age of 20, or you were a spinster. So she goes and marries someone very quickly afterwards. His name was William Williamson, and he's not too keen on his new wife going to her ex-boyfriend's church where he's the pastor. So they give it a few Sundays before they return, and then they return, and it's a communion Sunday, right? But John is up there giving communion to the congregation members, and when it's Sophie's turn, he decides to turn her down for communion. Now, most of the time, we believe in an open table. Anyone's welcome within the United Methodist Church as far as communion goes. So John refuses her communion, and he said it was because she skipped church, which I'm like, ooh, that's a lot. But because she skipped church and because she was so quick to marry right after she professed her love for John. So I feel like there might have been a little more heartache on his side. But needless to say, in front of the whole church, she was denied communion. So then her husband decides to sue John Wesley. And so then that goes into its own thing. He was suing her over defaming his wife. So now John has to go to court in the colonial justice system, I guess. And so the judge is actually Sophie's uncle. Talk about a small town. So things are not looking great for John at all. He continues to insist he's done nothing wrong. He refused communion to others that were against the British government. Remember, at this time, we were still under British rule. And so John thinks he did nothing wrong. However, rumors, this is the South, rumors spread. And his church, the attendance begins to plummet. Wesley's trial before the uncle was about to land him in a deep debt or in jail. And so Wesley does the only brave thing he can think of. He gets on the first boat back to England. And so he runs away, and there was a public warning that the judge issued. If anyone was to help Wesley escape, they would also be prosecuted. But to my knowledge, no one was prosecuted. Wesley made it over in England, never to return to America. It just wasn't his cup of tea. He did write to his friends and tell them that if you borrowed a book from me, send it back on the next boat. He wanted to make sure he left in a hurry, and he didn't have time to collect all his books. I don't know if he got all of his books back either, but that was the Wesley brothers' experience. Now, Charles had gone back a few years earlier. He just was not keen on Georgia at all. So the Wesley brothers remained over in Europe, but that didn't stop the other Methodists coming to America within the time of the 1751 through 1775. We have other British Methodists making their way to America. Philip Otterburn will be one of them we discuss later. And then we also know, who has heard of a circuit rider? A few of us, yeah, circuit riders. In 1764, Robert Strawbridge was the first circuit rider in America. And so circuit riders were pastors that traveled from meeting place to meeting place, preaching, and otherwise known as circuits. So they were a huge part of the Methodist movement in England, and of course, why not bring it to America? We were a lot more spread out than they are, many more miles to travel for meetings. So pastors would usually have 25 to 30 meeting spots to ride to on horseback. So they just preach a sermon, jump on the horse, and head to the next one. And anyone could be a circuit rider themselves, as long as you could preach and ride a horse. Those were the two qualifying things. The pay was actually, it wasn't that bad, but if you are part of SPRC, do not get any any ideas, because I don't ride horseback. So the pay was $64 a year, and was later raised to $100 a year in the 1800s. And your horse was actually furnished for you. So you didn't really have to buy your transportation there. Kind of nice. So Methodism was able to spread very quickly through the circuit riders, and this form of itineracy, which is a word that some of you may have heard, some of you may not, but that is actually where we get our model of itineracy today. We have pastors that move around every few years. You get some fresh blood, you get to see other pastors, other talents, and so that is where the itineracy process for the Methodist Church is drawn from. Next, we have the 1766 through 1768, which is the first Methodist congregation is established. Sorry, I made it a little far. I can scoot over a little bit. So, the first Methodist congregation, that was located in the financial district of New York City. In New York, you can be a new man and a new Methodist. And so that is in the middle of Manhattan. There's a spot for it today. It is a new building, but it wasn't the one they originally built back in the 1700s. But there are a few people that were formative in building that congregation in the first Methodist church. Barbara Heck was one of them. And the way I like to remember her is she says, "What the heck are you doing?" So they were Irish immigrants that had come over, and she was very frustrated about the life that her and her friends were living. And so she walks in on her friends one day, and they're all gambling, and she has just had enough. So she takes all the cards and she throws them in the fire, and she goes to her cousin, Philip Embry, who used to be a pastor, but he had kind of stepped away from that in America, and she said, "Whatever you do, you've got to preach to these people. We're losing ourselves. We need the word." And so he decides to pick up his old trade and start preaching to groups that she had formed within the homes. And so that was the first of the Methodist congregation. They continued to grow. A man named Thomas Webb also offered his services through preaching. He was associated with John Wesley as well. And they were able to fund and build the first church. And I made it blue because their first church was blue stucco. in the middle of New York City. And so that was their own chapel on John Street in 1768. Now the next one we have here is Francis Asbury. Has anyone heard of a Francis Asbury? Or maybe the last name might sound familiar. There's an Asbury Theological Seminary, a few other well-known Methodist things. At the age of 22, he decided, well, John Wesley had asked him, but he was willing, to come to America and join within the circuit writing. And we'll get more to him here in a while. Now, 1775 through 1776, the Revolutionary War is taking off. And John Wesley really, he remained Anglican priest, Church of England, until the day he died. He didn't really mean the Methodist Church to become its own thing. It was more of a movement, not a denomination. But it's really hard to remain Church of England when the colonies do not want any part of England. And so for the Methodist movement, a lot of the British Methodist pastors here decided to go back. They really didn't want to be part of this new country that would soon to be America. So two pastors chose to stay behind. Francis Asbury was one of them. I didn't know the other name, and he really didn't show up on the other part of the timeline, so I'll let you do that research later. But Francis Asbury was one of them that decided to stay and stick it out. And once Wesley realized there's no stopping those Methodists and there's no stopping those Americans, he decided to ordain Thomas Coke, which, as you see, there's a picture of Asbury, and Thomas Coke is right under him. And so he ordained Thomas Coke as a superintendent and sent him to America to help start what would become the Methodist Church. And so the reason he did that is there were no pastors here to serve communion. They only really had the lay pastors, and at that time, circuit riders, they couldn't do communion. You had to have the elders do that. And when all the British Methodist pastors left, there really wasn't anyone. So, and the Church of England was not interested in ordaining anyone new. So Wesley kind of took it upon himself to make sure that America could have the sacraments. And so we have Coke, who's coming over to also ordain and commission Asbury. And a fun fact, Thomas Coke, his last name Coke, and Asbury, Cokesbury is our publishing house. We like to play on words there. And that is where those two influential names are still with us today in a lot of ways. So, moving along, we're going to ordain Asbury. We get to the 1784 Christmas conference. I know we all love to come for a 30-minute service on Christmas Eve to be together, right? I love seeing all your shining faces out there. It's wonderful. It's a candlelight experience. I would hopefully never have to ask you guys to come to a meeting on Christmas Eve, but these guys felt that it was necessary to have the Christmas conference that took place on Christmas Eve. It was at Lovely Lane Chapel in Baltimore, Maryland, and it lasted 10 days. But yeah, so they were very excited to be there, I'm sure. There were 81 people, and nearly 60 of them were pastors, and this was the birth of the Methodist Episcopal Church. So we have Asbury is the first superintendent in America, but before he would let Thomas Coke ordain him, he wanted a vote from the American pastors before he was commissioned. He said that they should be able to get to choose who they have. So again, this is hand in hand right after the Revolutionary War, right? So we're built on a democracy. The people deserve a vote here. So of course they voted yes, and he was ordained as a deacon, an elder, and consecrated as a superintendent in 3 consecutive days. That's only happened once. It has not happened again, and I think the system probably wouldn't let it happen again because a deacon and elder was like this as far as going from a deacon track to an elder position up until 1996. You couldn't just become an elder. You had to first start off as a deacon and then move to the elder. But the process of ordination now goes through local church approval, district committee approval, certified candidate approval, board of ordained ministry for commissioning as provisional members, residence in ministry for 3 years, board of ordained ministry for ordination. In total, mine has taken 6 years, so not 3 days. But it has been a wonderful journey, and we understand why the process is so. We're very methodical. Also, at the Christmas conference, the people also voted on 12 lay preachers who were elected to be ordained elders. And then there was also, when Thomas Coke came, John Wesley sent him with something called the Sunday service. He said, those American Methodists, they're just running amok over there. So let's make sure they have a really good order of worship to keep them straight. And so that is what the Sunday service was. It was a worship guide that was kind of like an order of worship. A lot of things of what we do today, while we have scripture readings in certain places or communion liturgy or things like that, originated from this first document. It would eventually turn into what we have as the book of worship that guides pastors and leaders into different types of services we offer for congregation members, whether that be funerals or Christmas Eve services, anything you can imagine. It's in the book of worship. And so we're thankful for that, because John Wesley was keeping us on track to where we would be intentional about our worship time and space. We also have Richard Allen and Absalom Jones. These were the two first African American pastors that were licensed to preach. They were both slaves who were able to purchase their own freedom. And so with that, this was the time that they were approved and voted on, and they were able to preach. But not too much longer after that, well, I think I skipped one, but Thomas Coke and Asbury were able to meet with Washington, which is pretty cool. I can't imagine meeting with the president now. But they were able to meet with Washington right before he was inaugurated as the first president. So Methodism was huge. It had really taken off, and it had grown in popularity, and that showed within the development of America. In 1792, we have Richard Allen, who led African Americans out of St. George's Church. At St. George's Church, whites and African Americans were able to worship together, which is amazing. That's something we're really not sure how to do that today. So they were able to do that, and Richard Allen was appointed as what would be like an associate pastor there, and he was able to preach at the 5 a.m. service. Let me tell you what I will not be doing here, a 5 a.m. service. But he was excited to preach and loved doing it. And so African Americans' attendance rose while he was preaching there, but so did racial segregation and discrimination towards those attending. So within the service, Richard Allen led a walkout of the African Americans in attendance, and this would begin the African Methodist Episcopal Church, AME, church that will soon develop within a few years. In 1794, we have something called camp meetings. Has anyone heard of those before? Yeah, little, awesome. This was also known within the time as the Second Great Awakening. A lot of like a revival in that kind of sense. But there was definitely more burning freedom in America that you didn't have to answer to a higher rule. And that too was showing within the religious movement. So religion was now more attainable. There were more denominations. It was more accessible for everyone. And so people had exuberant behavior. There was more, I just remember them talking in class, like people would be falling over, passing out, which if the Spirit leads you to do that in a Sunday worship service, I'm not here to stop you. We just want to make sure, watch the corners of pews, land on a cushion, that kind of thing. But this was more feeling. It was all about feeling. Their response was, if you haven't felt God, then you couldn't preach God. And so they questioned academics, and orders were thrown out the window. And we still hold camp meetings today, so this is something from our tradition that we've held on to. They're a little more methodical in that sense. I was texting with a friend earlier. She goes to one in Van Cleve every year. That's they have a cabin there that every year a lot of the Methodist pastors and families, they gather down there for a revival experience out in the woods. And we also have Methodist campgrounds and campsites for our kids to go to summer camp to. So that's where the camp experience of camp meetings came from, and why it's so fundamental within our Methodist heritage and where we are today. So then as we move along to the 1800s-ish, the Church of the United Brethren, which was Philip Otterborn and Martin Bohm, and then the Evangelical Association denominations were born. And the Evangelical Association, that was Jacob Albright. These were Reformed Lutheran backgrounds, and the churches that are red, they will be what is eventually formed into the United Methodist Church. And once we start getting to some of the yellow ones, those will be ones that broke off from the United Methodist Church that have not rejoined the United Methodist Church denomination. They are their own denomination and are not within the United Methodist Church umbrella. So we have these, they're Reformed, and the Methodist Episcopal Church, which is what came up on the Christmas conference, that is from Church of England, of course. So then we have 1812. I'll scoot up. This is the General Conference, was composed of elected delegates. Has anyone been to an annual conference before? I remember, that's where I met you, Tim. So annual conference, that's where we elect delegates within the congregation to then go to that meeting. And if we have time, we'll get to the breakdown of general conference versus annual conference and all those conferencing things. But this is where we elect lay members, like congregation members, along with pastors to go to these meetings so that there's more of an equal say and an equal voice. It's not just pastors up there making all the decisions, because sometimes we don't know what all's best, right? So we try to be a voice of the people as well. So this is a lot, the 1812 is built up a lot like the way we have it now in today's time. In 1816 through 1845, this is where we start to see a lot of the churches split. So we have 1816 through 1821. This is the African Methodist Episcopal Church and the African Methodist Episcopal Zion Church. That was Richard Allen's church that led the walkout. So this is where they become their own denomination in that sense. And then we have 1830 is the Methodist Protestant Church. Again, that one's red, so eventually they do come back to what becomes the United Methodist Church. And then in 1842, the Wesleyan Methodist Church, now the Wesleyan Church, they break off and they are still their own entity. Then we have 1844 through 1845. And if you can see, the blue is where things are happening in the country, right? So we see it is the build-up towards the Civil War. So in 1844 through 1845, we have the Methodist Episcopal Church and the Methodist Episcopal Church South split over the issues of slavery and episcopacy. And again, that was a few years even before the Civil War, but because Methodism was so dominant within the time period, it was one of the things that built up to it. And you might ask, well, what caused it so early? And I might tell you, I got on the internet and figured it out. So I'll just do a quick summary of it. But there was a bishop, and this goes a lot into where we are, the United Methodist Church is today, but we'll get there. So the bishop, James O. Andrew, was a resident of Georgia. I feel like a lot of things happen in Georgia. But so he was a resident there. And it was known that within this time, the Methodist Church was against slavery. If you were a clergy person, you could not own slaves. Well, he was a bishop, and he married a woman who had inherited slaves from her late husband. And so many Northern Methodists were appalled by this because, clergy couldn't own slaves, and now we have a bishop that owns them. So a 6-week session began with the longest general conference in Methodist history. Let me tell you what I don't want to do for 6 weeks. Be in a meeting. So there was a large concern over this, and he was prepared to just resign from episcopacy, resign from being a bishop. He was prepared for that. But the southern delegates, what would become the Methodist Episcopal Church South, were scared that that would cause a huge split. He didn't buy the slaves, therefore was there a concern. So 6 weeks of meeting happened, and then eventually, and his reasoning was again, being in Georgia, you couldn't just emancipate a slave. He was like, it really wouldn't make sense. It's impractical. And I didn't live back in that time, so I'm not quite sure, and I can't tell that firsthand. But his reasoning was it would be worse on them for him to. And he did have proper living standards for them, and he was afraid that they might go into worse hands if he did free them. So we can see that there's a lot of concern here, and hopefully, as people say the words, with the best intent, we were, by the grace of God, doing the best we could. All in all, 6 weeks, a motion asking Andrew, the bishop, to step down was 111 to 69. So he stepped down, and immediately after that, the church began discussions of the split. And so that is how we came to 1845 having a Methodist Episcopal Church and a Methodist Episcopal Church South. And they would remain split for 94 years with 2 strands of the Methodist Episcopal Church. Then, as we move, Civil War, we know that happened. We have another split of the Colored Methodist Episcopal Church, which would then become the Christian Methodism Episcopal Church. They're yellow, so they are not United Methodist at this point. They became their own denomination and stayed that way. And in 1876, we see that the Methodist Episcopal Church votes at their general conference to decide to divide annual conferences instead of geographically, which is the way ours are divided today. We'll look at a map of that in a bit. So instead of dividing geographically, they're going to divide by racial lines. So we see that there was a split of the church that happened, but we see it still happening on an annual conference level as well. In the 1900s, we have the Industrial Revolution movement. And so I added a little plane here because that's when the Wright brothers flew their first plane. And then we have the Model T Ford happening. And then we have a booming production of steel and iron. And so with all of this production rising, so did the mistreatment of others for production. And in 1908, the Methodist Episcopal Church developed their social creed. And the social creed originated over the outrage of miserable lives for the millions of workers in factories, mines, mills, tenants, and company towns. And so this was the first denomination to ever adopt an official social creed. And I'm going to read you some of the things that we still have a social creed to this day. It's changed a bit since 1908, as it because our society has changed a bit since 1908. And so to be in good faith with that. But some of theirs from 1908 was for equal rights and complete justice for all men. Makes sense. Protection of the worker from dangerous machinery, occupational diseases, or injuries and mortality. Did anyone ever read The Jungle? but is it Upton Sinclair? Is it? Yeah. I just remember reading in high school, and it's like meat packing industry in the industrial age, and I just cannot imagine that people went through that. But this was a social concern. And so these were some of the things that the Methodists were working against, that to abolish child labor, because that was also happening. Suppression of the sweatshops, so unfavorable working conditions. The Methodists are actively working against these things. Gradual and reasonable reduction hours of labor to maintain the highest human life. Keeping the Sabbath day, and these might be things that we might need to look at in our working days as of now. A living wage for every industry. These were major concerns back in that time that are somewhat concerns now. And we do have what leads us to our social creed, eventually developed into our social principles within the United Methodist Church. And these are found within our book of discipline. And I don't know if I have it lined out to where we'll hit on the social principles, but tempt me with a good time, because they're a lot to talk about. But they address the social world, the natural world, political, economic, and the nurturing world. So these are just the United Methodist stances on all of these things and what we can do. How can we share God's love in the world that we're in? So in 1914 and 1918, we have World War I. The Methodist Church, is kind of hanging back. Not too many changes happened then. And then we go to 1939 to 1945. That's World War II. Again, not too many changes happening within the Methodist Church at this time. But then 1939, we have the formation of the Methodist Church. Here is a look at the jurisdictions that we have. So the Methodist Church, the Methodist Episcopal Church, and the Methodist Episcopal Church South decided that maybe we could come back together again. And so we did in 1939. And so these were the jurisdictional areas. We still have 5 out of 6 of these areas. As you can see, most of them are divided geographically. However, the one with the lines in it is called the Central Conference, and that was the one that they did based on racial divides. So they took the African American churches within the Methodist Church and had them all in the Central Conference, so that you could have your geographical areas and they could have their conference. So in 1940, 1 year later, immediate efforts started to get rid of the Central Conference. And then in 1946, we have the formation of the Evangelical United Brethren Church. And so these were the churches that were from the Reformed Lutheran Church background. So the Evangelical Church and Church of the United Brethren in Christ. Fun fact about this one, women originally had rights in the Church of the United Brethren in Christ. Women could be ordained. But when this merger happened, they were like, never mind. So if you were a woman that was ordained, I am sorry about it. You could find another denomination, I guess. Which shortly after that, in 1956, women were given full rights to be ordained in the Methodist Church. And so luckily we have not waited on that, because come July I will be right before you and ordained. So glad to have that, right? Yeah. Thanks for all the work you guys have done over time. So then we have the Methodist Church giving women's rights, and then along with that, with the Central Conference being working on being eliminated, we have the Civil Rights Movement happening during all this time. And so we have the Civil Rights Act of 1964. And shortly after that, we have what is known as the United Methodist Church is formed. It's the merger of the Methodist Church and the Evangelical United Brethren Church. The Central Conference no longer exists anymore. The last one they had was in 1967. So we go back to the UMC having 5 jurisdictional areas in the U.S. And then we go globally with 7 conferences outside of the U.S. Now these 7 areas outside of the U.S., they use the name Central Conference. I guess they were just really plugged in on that name. So not to be confused with the one that was no longer in existence within the U.S. So here's a look at what those are. I'm actually going to do this. So we have the 5 areas. As you can see, we are actually in the yellow, part of the southeastern jurisdiction, and they are all geographically based. Then we go up to, this is what United Methodists around the world, and so you have our 5 areas, but remember, the birth of the Methodist Episcopal Church. The Methodist Church started in America, so although we look so tiny, we're actually very concentrated in United Methodist churches, and then we have all over the globe. That's why we're a global United Methodist Church. And as attendance is actually going down in the U.S., it's rising substantially across the world. So that is exciting for the United Methodist Church. In those, the central conferences are the Philippines, and this is actually where the 2020 General Conference was going to be held. Thanks a lot, 2020. And so it's going to be on the Philippines. There's that little red dot there on the side, if you can see where the Philippines are. That was going to be the first General Conference we had outside of America, so it's going to be amazing. And then COVID happened, so that's maybe one day. And then we have Northern Europe and Eurasia, Germany, Central and Southern Europe, West Africa, Congo, and Africa itself. So, that clock, no, it's right. Okay, we're just kind of talk fast. So, those are the conferences that have developed over time. But we can't do this justice without bringing us all the way up to where we are now in the United Methodist Church. In 2019, if you are in the Methodist realm, I'm sure you might have heard rumors and buzzes, but in 2019, we had the Commission on the Way Forward. That was a special called conference that the General Conference of 2016 asked the bishops, the Council of Bishops, to call. So in 2016, there were many concerns that arose about the ordination of clergy in the LGBTQ community, and whether pastors could marry people of the LGBTQ community. So this was a large concern. It wasn't voted on in 2016, so that's why they had the special conference. But one thing that did happen was in the Western jurisdiction, I can go up here a little bit. Western jurisdiction, that's the blue. There was a bishop elected, Reverend Karen Oliveto, and she was openly married and gay, and so she was elected as bishop. So the South Central jurisdiction, which is the purple, files a declaratory petition on that to the Judicial Council. But again, remember when we were going through the civil rights and we split from Methodist Episcopal Church and Methodist Episcopal Church South? Well, that was due because one bishop, not everyone liked that, so they held a vote that everyone could have a say on that. So after that division happened, they said, you know what, bishops are only held to their jurisdictional area. So only the bishops in their jurisdictional area get to have a say whether that's okay or not. And that is exactly what has happened now to where the United Methodist Church is, because it was found that they're only accountable to their jurisdiction. Therefore, the College of Bishops in that jurisdiction vote. So if the entire jurisdiction is okay with that, then it's okay, because the way our structure and our discipline is now allows that. Again, because what had happened in years ago, we worked to not let that happen again. And that's kind of where we are now within the church and what will happen as we move forward. So the Commission on the Way Forward was in 2019. I remember it was right before I went for my commissioning interview, and I was a nervous wreck. But it was okay, because I made it, and there was a lot of grace and a lot of love, and I could go through all the plans that came forward in the Commission on the Way Forward, but it would be pointless because what was voted on went to the Judicial Council, and we'll go over that in a bit, and it was voted unconstitutional anyways. So, which was why everyone was looking forward to 2020 to figure out the future of the church. But we know, I gotta go. In 2020, COVID happened. And COVID is still happening because if you're aware of the news, the general conference that was supposed to happen in 2021 got postponed in 2022, and the general conference that was supposed to happen in 2022 got postponed to 2024. So we are actually waiting until 2024 to have a general conference again, and that will be whatever the future is of the United Methodist Church, like any other general conference, whatever the future is of the United Methodist Church, because the general conference is the only body that can speak for the United Methodist Church. And I will say it is frustrating at times to be patient and to wait, but when going through the history of the United Methodist Church and seeing how it was so important that everyone had a vote on who could be a pastor and how it would develop and how it would go on the worship services, maybe we take the time to wait until everyone can have a vote globally, as we are all part of the United Methodist Church. So it may be long, it may be daunting, but I think as United Methodists we can hold out a little longer till we can meet to where it's safe for everyone and everyone is accessible for a vote. Any questions on all that history? Because in 3 minutes, I can take you on a journey from the local church to general conference. Fun. And Daniel's actually going to cover a lot of the local church area. But if you're a congregation member, the local church is where you hold it. That's where your board of trustees, that's where your finance committee, all that happens on a local church level. And the local church is most important because what would all these other conferences be without the local church? And we will have more in detail on that one. The district level, congratulations, you're in the Hattiesburg district, if you did not know that. Those are just groups of local churches that are geographically grouped together. You also have a district superintendent that's able to assist with the overseeing of the churches, that's able to meet with the bishop and pair pastors together with other churches. Then we also have, on a larger scale, the annual conference. Guess what? It meets annually when we don't have COVID, but we did meet over Zoom, so we meet annually one way, electronically or in person. But that is where you set ministry priorities together. It approves of those being ordained and supports the local churches. This is where you elect delegates to go to general conference and jurisdictional conferences. So at annual conference, we elected people to go forward to the jurisdictional level and what we thought was going to be the 2020 conference back in 2019, the last time I went to one. But that's where you're able to vote on those. You also vote on constitutional amendments on that level. Jurisdictional conferences, again, that's here. Those are even just a larger geographical area. That is where your bishops are elected and assigned, and they determine boundaries of annual conferences, that if those need to be redrawn. Those also elect members to be on general agencies. Think of like discipleship ministries that provides curriculum for us because you pay apportionments. Guess what? We get stuff in return. They are able to provide curriculum for us. There's the General Board of Church and Society, of Religion and Race, the United Methodist Men, and the United Methodist Women. All these things come out of the jurisdictional level. Then General Conference happens every 4 years. And again, this is the only body that gets to speak for the United Methodist Church. I remember back in 2019 when all the fake news is happening about the split of the UMC, and I said, that's crazy because we haven't had General Conference yet, and that's the only person that can say that happens. So that is the only body that gets to speak. That's around 600 to 1,000 members, depending, and for every clergy person, there is a congregation/laity member, so it's equal parts congregation and pastors. Again, a fair voice. You don't have a bunch of pastors up there telling you what to do. And that's a good thing a lot of times. You hand enough of us a mic and we'll go for days. But they also do church budgets. They set connectional giving priorities, and that's all on the general conference level. That happens every 4 years. You have the Council of Bishops that includes all active and retired bishops. Those provide oversight for the vision of the church, and they are the ones that call special sessions if needed. That would be the 2019 session of the Commission on the Way Forward. They were able to call that for a particular purpose. And then you have Judicial Council. That's 9 members that are elected at General Conference. And those determine constitutional actions of the General Conference. Again, what happened in 2019 went to them and they ruled it unconstitutional. They review all the bishops' decisions of law, and they're the final court of appeal in the church's judicial system. So going through all these, you can kind of see the development of the United States, development of the Methodist Church. We've kind of gone hand in hand a lot because those are so important, that everyone does get to have a voice and everything's fair and everything's right. We don't have someone just telling us what to do. We have God telling us what to do, and as long as we hold true to that, I think we'll be okay. Any questions? This wig is getting hot. So, thank y'all, and if you do have questions, you can let me know and I'll find out what I can about it. But thank y'all for coming. I hope you enjoy.